Good to be back with everybody. I hope you had a restful afternoon. I hope you got your Sunday afternoon naps in after a great lunch. Everyone's rested and ready to go. We are going to jump forward in our study with Moses. You know, we spent time in Exodus chapter 1, we spent time in Exodus chapter 2, and we're just going to jump forward to a scenario that a lot of the Bible kind of hinges around. We're going to get to the golden calf over in Exodus chapter 32. But it'd be helpful to establish the context that gets us there. So as you follow the life of Moses, you have the 40 years where he's with Pharaoh's family. And then as we read this morning, he tries to make himself known as the providential deliverer. He's rejected. He spends 40 years in the land of Midian. And then at the end of that 40-year period, when he's 80, God comes to him and appears to him in a burning bush and sends him back to the land of Egypt so that he can try to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. And what God communicates to Moses in the bush is that he's going to lead the people of Israel out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And when he does that, that Moses is supposed to bring the people back to him to the mountain. So where Moses interacts with God in the burning bush is around Mount Sinai. And God says, I want you to bring these people to me. And so several times when Moses is asking Pharaoh, let the people go, he's pitching it as an opportunity for the Israelites to worship. We need to go worship the Lord at the mountain. And toward the end of those plagues, Pharaoh starts to concede a little bit, but he wants to make sure, they can only go one day's journey away. Moses is like, no, that's not going to work. Well, you all can go, but you have to leave your animals. Moses is like, no, that's not going to work. Like, we're going to go as far as we need to go. We're going to take as much as we need to take. And the whole paradigm is we're going to go worship the Lord. And so after all of the plagues, after the death of the firstborn, he drives the Israelites out, and they plunder Egypt, which means as they leave, the Egyptians are throwing gifts at them. And they leave with all of these belongings that they really don't deserve, they haven't worked for. It's an act of mercy and grace. And then you get to the Red Sea and the Red Sea crossing, where Pharaoh has had a change of heart. He realizes this is economic suicide, and he sends the army out after them, and they corner them at the Red Sea. And God provides a means of deliverance and miraculously parts the water, sends the Israelites through, swallows up the Egyptian army, and they're on the other side. And by that time, you're in Exodus 14:15, and you have all of the Israelites singing songs of praise for saving them. And then you go through, and you've got the quail, and you've got the manna, and you've got them grumbling about there's not enough water, and all this other stuff, until they finally get to the base of Mount Sinai. And when they get to Sinai, you have one of the most visible manifestations of God's presence in the Bible, where God shows up on a mountain and the thing burns and darkness descends on it in a cloud and the people are terrified. The ground is shaking. And they tell Moses, it's like, I'm looking for a volunteer, and the whole army steps back, and there's Moses. And they send Moses up, and Moses, you go talk to God for us. And so Moses actually goes up, and he goes up with Joshua, and they're gone for 40 days. Now that gets us to Exodus chapter 32. And I want us to read through that chapter, just setting the scene and establishing the context like we did earlier today. And let's start reading in verse 1. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron said to them, Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. There's so much about this that's just so disappointing. But I want us to think about it for just a second from maybe a slightly different perspective. And I'm not justifying anything that happens here, but I'd like us to have a little bit more comprehension. Okay? Back in 2020, maybe 2021, I was reading the collection of works by Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an American. He was a freed slave. He was born a slave, but ended up fleeing to the north and achieved his freedom. His name is not his birth name. He doesn't know what his birth name was. He doesn't know his family name. That was lost. He suspects he knew who his father was, but he never met his birth father. But Frederick Douglass ended up learning how to read and eventually made it a passion of his, even before he attained his own freedom, trying to help teach other enslaved men and women how to read. And through that process, he learned to communicate really well. And so once he became free and he was staunchly free, there was not as much risk of someone grabbing him and taking him back to the South, he started to communicate and teach about slavery and freedom and being made in the image of God and what exactly that meant, and trying to communicate the way that slavery dehumanizes both the oppressor and the slave. And one of the things that he tried to communicate, and he did so really well, was what he called a slavery mindset. What he meant by that was slavery is dehumanizing, absolutely. American slavery in particular was dehumanizing. Where you treat someone in a way that is subhuman. You're trying to convince them, and you've convinced yourself, that it's okay for you to treat them that way because they are not like you, they're less than you. They're not created in the image of God, you're created in the image of God, they are less than that. And so that's what you're convincing yourself of, and that's what you're trying to convince them of, that it's appropriate for you to treat them this way because they are less than. And like I said, it dehumanizes the person who does it, and it dehumanizes the person who's on the receiving end of it. And he saw that in several different ways. One of the ways that he saw that was when he was trying to teach these people how to read. Because they would tell him, Negroes aren't smart enough to be able to read. They had bought the lie. They were convinced, because of what they'd been told their whole lives, that it was true, that they were less than intellectually, even though they weren't. But they believed it. And that even when they got free, and they were in free states, the reality was they had crossed a line, but that doesn't stop a lifetime of wondering if someone's going to grab you. And so even though they were in a free place, they still had these PTSD moments where they're like, is someone going to get me? Is someone going to get me? And even though they're safe, they don't feel safe. There's this slavery mindset that follows them. Think about that for a second, and that dynamic, and then think about the Israelites. They're free. The Red Sea stands between them and Egypt. But especially that first generation that was free was not free. I mean, they were physically free, but emotionally and intellectually, they wrestled with their bondage for the rest of their lives. They doubted God. They wrestled with fierce independence, like we've got to be able to take care of ourselves because no one else is going to take care of us. Right? And so think about people like that have been in that circumstance for multiple generations, and you get to Mount Sinai where it's dark and shaking and on fire, and the guy that has led you there has been up there for over a month, and there's no cell phone, there's no pager, there's no way to email him, he's just gone. And he didn't tell you when he's coming back because he didn't know when he was coming back. What are people like that going to do? And again, I'm not justifying because what they did was wrong, but I think when you understand who they are and where they've come from a little bit better, there's a little bit more compassion. So when you get to verse 1 and it says the people saw that Moses delayed to come down, it's true. They were like, that mountain could have eaten him alive. There's a reason we didn't want to go. Because this is what was going to happen. And what we're looking for is we're looking for something to worship. And so when you get to verse 2, Aaron is the one who initiates the solution. Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives and your sons and your daughters and bring them to me. So the people did. They took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And in verse 4, there are 3 different verbs that are used to describe what Aaron did. And this is really important to emphasize. He received the gold and he fashioned it and he made a golden calf. Aaron is directly involved in this process. Okay? I don't think that he's the one that smelted everything. I don't think he's the one that got it all done all by himself. But Aaron was intimately involved in the creation of a golden calf. And then they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And then in verse 5, when Aaron saw this, and this is really important. You remember this morning when we talked about being afraid of something but not letting fear make the decision? I'm just going to read a couple of parallel versions from the English of verse 5. When Aaron saw this, is what the ESV says. The NEB says, then Aaron was afraid. The Durham Bible says, when Aaron saw their reaction. The CEV says, when Aaron saw what was happening. I mean, basically, Aaron looks out, and when this golden calf is presented to them, and he sees how excited they get over it and how they're getting worked up, he panics. You've got all of these people that are on the verge of doing really crazy things, and he knows if I try to get between them and what they want to do, this is not going to go well. So he jumps on board. And when he jumps on board and tries to control it, it says Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to Jehovah, Yahweh, the covenant name of God, that they have just entered into a covenant with while Moses is up on the mountain getting the stone tablets. This is the name that God has used to make himself known to his people here in Exodus. And so what you've got is they've fashioned an image that's familiar to them because the Egyptians worshipped the image of the calf. So he fashions something that they're familiar with, but then he attaches it to the name of Jehovah. And so it's not like he's just rejected God outright. He's actually trying to make this mismatch of the two. And then he says, we're going to have a feast. Tomorrow we're going to have a party. In verse 6, they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And not trying to be inappropriate, but that word in verse 6 for play is the same word that's used in Genesis 26, verse 8, to describe a couple of other adults that were being friendly with each other in marriage. So this party, this festival to the Lord, attached with this idolatrous image, is turning into something entirely inappropriate. Okay? And so what we can notice here is that while the ink is still wet on the contract between God and his people, they're at the bottom of the mountain breaking it. And I think we need to be compassionate and sympathetic with them, because if we were there, we probably would have done something similar and maybe gotten caught up in that. Because it's really easy for us who know the entire story of the Bible to be like, oh man, I wouldn't have done that. I would have been right next to Aaron, like smacking him. What are you doing? Stop that. No, you wouldn't have. No, you wouldn't have. Because no one else was. Odds are really high that you probably would have been right there with them. And me too, for that matter. I think we give ourselves too much credit. And when you continue reading in verse 7, the Lord said to Moses, so back up on the mountain, the Lord said to Moses, go down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They've turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They've made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I've seen this people, and behold, it's a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation out of you. Let's back up just for a second. And I want to try to help you visualize what this calf might have looked like and just how offensive it would have been to God. Okay? So, what I want you to think about is later on in Israel's history, when the kingdom of Israel divides with Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Rehoboam is in the south, and Jeroboam is in the north, and Rehoboam is the one who owns, he's the one who's governing, he's king over Jerusalem, where the temple is, and where all the temple worship of God is supposed to take place. People are supposed to be traveling down there multiple times a year to worship the Lord from all over Israel. And Jeroboam knows that. And he's got the majority of the tribes in the north. And his concern, and it's probably legitimate, his concern is that in these festival days, these people are going to be leaving his kingdom to come back down to Jerusalem to worship the Lord. And when they do that, it's going to soften them and make them go, you know, we really should belong as one nation and put ourselves under Rehoboam again. So to keep them from doing that, Jeroboam establishes 2 places of worship so they never have to leave the country. He sets up high places, and what he does is he creates idolatrous images like this golden calf. One in the south and one in the north of his kingdom. The one in the north was at Dan. Now they've discovered and uncovered that worship site. You can go and visit it. And I want to show a picture of that. The cultic site, the worship site at Tel Dan. Now, I'm going to point out something, and I'm going to put another picture up there kind of on top of it for some perspective. You look at this square right here, and you see the metal square with the horns on the corners? All right? That is there to represent the size of the altar where they would offer sacrifices. And the steps that the gentleman in the red shirt is walking up, those steps are only halfway constructed. They would have gone higher up. That gives you a sense of perspective of just how big that altar was. So imagine you've got priests officiating at this altar, and Jeroboam made priests out of people other than Levites. Think about how big that is. Okay? Now you keep going up and you have these steps. You see the people sitting on the steps underneath the tree. And at the top of the steps, there was a platform. It's kind of roped off. You're not supposed to go there. I got a picture out of a textbook that students and guides are supposed to use to prepare as they learn about Tel Dan. And you see, here's the altar. Here are the steps that the people on the tree are sitting under. Here's the platform. This little dot represents the size of a person. That represents the size of the golden calf. Maybe a little bit bigger than you thought. Because in our kids' coloring sheets, it's always really small. Because our kids' coloring sheets are so, that's what it was. I want you to think about that for just a second. And just on a side note, when the Israelites built synagogues, the majority of the time, the synagogues faced Jerusalem, and they encouraged people to face Jerusalem. All of this faces north. So this gentleman that's walking up the steps, his face is north, which means his back is toward what? Jerusalem, which means his back is toward the temple, which means his back is toward God. Literally. Like they set this up so that as you're doing all of this, you're not thinking looking toward, at all aware of Jehovah. It's actually the opposite of all that. Okay? Now, imagine the amount of gold that they must have gotten from all of those people. They must have gotten quite a bit. And they still had to make it portable because they were going to have to take it with them wherever they went. I wonder if it was gold-plated. I don't know. But my guess is whatever that golden calf looked like size-wise, it was probably much bigger than what we portray in our coloring sheets. All right, now, getting back to our text. We read verses 7 through 10, and what we read there is God is angry with his people. He's not going to share his glory with anybody. I mean, that's what he was communicating in the Ten Commandments. Like, they're doing the opposite of what he said. You will have no graven image before you. And what does Aaron do? He constructs a graven image while God's telling them, you shall not have a graven image. And we'll just say something about God's anger, that God's anger is not like our anger. And we need to make sure that we're not equating those two things. Because when God gets angry, it's not because he's lost his temper. God's anger is never out of control. God's anger is never arbitrary. God's anger is never excessive. God's anger is appropriate. God's anger is measured. So God's angry for a good reason. And this is a powerful point. Look at verse 9. The Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Unless I'm wrong, I think this is one of the first times in the Old Testament where the people are referred to as stiff-necked, but it is not the last time in the Old Testament that they're referred to as a stiff-necked people. And I think there's a reason for that. I want to make a connection here. Make sure you put your marker in Exodus 32, but then go over to Psalm 115. And I want to notice a really powerful dynamic that the psalmist just kind of mentions in passing when he talks about idolatry. In verse 4, the psalmist says, their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. Does that sound like a golden calf at Sinai? Verse 5, they have mouths, but they do not speak, and they have eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear, noses, but do not smell. They have hands, but do not feel, feet, but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. Verse 8, those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. On one hand, that is a terrifying thought. I mean, what he's saying is that idols are nothing. They're dead. They're vain. They're empty. They don't do anything. They can't move. They can't speak. They can't hear. They can't smell. They can't taste. They can't do anything. They are dead. And what he's saying in verse 8 is that spiritually speaking, the people who worship those things, the people who trust in those things, become like what they worship. If you worship something dead, you become dead. If you worship something worthless, you become worthless. The principle is you become like what you worship. I don't think it's accidental that as the Israelites construct their own golden calf, a cow that's got a really stiff neck, that God turns around and says, this is a stiff-necked people. Why? Because you become like what you worship. Now, the flip side of that is really hopeful. The flip side of that is we worship and serve a living God who's merciful and compassionate and beautiful and incredible and generous. And if I worship a God like that, then I get to become living and beautiful and generous. I become like what I worship. So there's hope in the process. The danger is, what are you worshiping? The Israelites were worshiping a stiff-necked idol. They became stiff-necked. And every time that phrase is used throughout the rest of their history, they should flash back to this. Okay? Now, think about, just for a second, what God is offering Moses. What he's offering, frankly, would tempt anyone more prideful than Moses. He's saying, I am so done with these people. I'm so frustrated with these people. I am done with them. Forget it. We're going to hit the reset button. I'm wiping all of them out. All those people down there, gone. And then we're starting with you. And y'all need to be really honest with yourselves. There are times where you would have jumped at that. Where you were so frustrated, you were so tired, you were so exhausted, you were so whatever that you're like, yep, I'm on board. Let's go. Let's see what Moses did with that. Verse 11. Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? And there's something significant there. In the beginning of the chapter, the Israelites are like, where is Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt? And then when God tells them what's going on, hey, go down for these people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt. And Moses is like, no. These are your people that you brought out of the land of Egypt. These are not my people. These are your people that you delivered. And then he asks a question in verse 12. Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised you I'll give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. It would have been so tempting. Why didn't Moses take him up on it? Because what Moses does here is he intercedes. He says, wait, God, wait, please, don't do that to these people. Not that you don't have the right to, but if you do this, how are these other people going to respond? And what are they going to think? And he intercedes. Where did he get that kind of heart? There's a suggestion about that. Why don't you turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17. And while you do that, I'm plugging my computer in, or you don't get any more PowerPoint. First Samuel 17. And 1 Samuel 17, you've got the interaction with David and Goliath, where David is so frustrated and insulted with how Goliath has been throwing out slurs against the living God of Israel. And he's so offended that he's finally going to do something about it. None of the other Israelites have stood up to Goliath. The giant of Israel, King Saul, is just hanging out in his tent, not doing anything. And so David takes it upon himself and says, man, I'm going down there. And Saul is offering him his armor and all these other things, and David has turned them down. He's not going to take that sword. He's going to go out there with what he as a shepherd has been using for all of these years. And when he's trying to explain to Saul where he's at, why would he do this? In verses 34 through 35, he says, your servant David used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it. I delivered it. Same word all through Exodus. I delivered it out of his mouth. Why would David do that? I mean, surely there's a loss program in place here. Like a certain percentage of his animals you expect aren't going to make it. It's just acceptable loss. But for David, it wasn't. If one of these animals got one of these sheep, got one of these goats, he was going to go out after it and deliver that animal. Why? Because shepherds risk their lives for the flock. It's what they do. Where did Moses learn that? From 40 years in Midian taking care of animals. He didn't learn that from the school of Egyptian theology. He didn't learn that from Pharaoh training school and etiquette. He learned that from 40 years of taking care of dumb animals. And so he intercedes for these people that have put themselves in a horrible position. And he intervenes, and God listens to him. Let's come back to our text in Exodus 32. Let's pick up with verse 15. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain, and the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, tablets that were written on both sides, on the front and on the back they were written. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there's a noise of war in the camp. But he said, it is not the sound of shouting for victory, or the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear. And as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. And there are a couple of things to say about that. As Moses comes down, they get closer, they can hear the noise. And Joshua is like, there's a war. I hear the noise of a war. And Moses is like, that is not a war. I mean, you come up on your house and your kids have planned an unplanned, unsanctioned party. You get close to the house, you know that's a party. And the kids are like, man, what's all the noise at the house? Look, I know what that noise is. Moses knew, but he didn't see it. And then when he saw it firsthand, he sees this calf and he sees what they're doing. His emotions catch up with God's emotions. So that principle of, we become like what we worship, we learn to feel about things the way that God feels about things. We learn to care about things the way that God cares about things. And Moses did not do anything wrong by breaking those tablets because the people had already broken the covenant. And then he does something that I've always thought was just weird. Why did he make them drink gold? And I think there's a connection in the text. You remember when Aaron had the thing made, there were 3 verbs that described him constructing it. And now you've got 3 things deconstructing it. So textually, you've got this link, 3 and 3. Okay, that's numbers, that's neat. Why drink gold? There are a couple of things to observe about that. There are a couple of places in the Old Testament, 1 Kings 15, verse 13, and then 2 Kings 10, 25 through 27, where you have these kings that will end up destroying idols. And they try to destroy them so thoroughly that people can't go back to them. So like in 1 Kings 15:13, Asa defiled the image of Asherah by cutting it down and burning it by a brook where the remains would be scattered. You see the 3, cutting it down, burning it, and then it's going to be scattered. Or 2 Kings 10, 25 through 27, Jehu's destruction of the house of Baal and making it a latrine. He turned that idol's house into a place to use the bathroom. There's a Jewish gentleman that made this observation. If you burn this gold up and grind it up and then throw it in water and people drink it, what happens to the things that you consume? They stay in you for forever. What happened to that quarter your kid swallowed? Stay in it for forever? Comes out. I'm not trying to be crass, but did you go on a treasure hunt looking for that quarter? No. 2 things. The process by which Moses destroys this idol, first off, defiles it. Because the waste that your body eliminated, according to the Levitical laws, was unclean. So whatever your body passes is unclean. If they're passing that gold, you don't touch it. And if he powderized it and it's being eliminated all over the camp for several days, you are not going to get that gold back. You're not going to make a golden calf out of that gold ever again. Now, you may make it out of some other metal, you may make it out of some other material, but you're not using that material anymore. It's just gone. And so I think what Moses does here is he defiles this God and scatters it so thoroughly they're never going to make it again. Okay? So what you've got is the idol was defiled so thoroughly they would never return to it. Pick up in verse 21. And Moses said to Aaron, "What did this people do to you, that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" And Aaron said, "Let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people. They're set on evil." Brother to brother, Were they waterboarding you? Like 40 days. What on earth could they have done to you to make you do this? And Aaron is such a chump. You know the people. They're just kind of bad. You're not wrong. But that is not how that went down. And so he's passing the buck. Verse 23, they said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. That's what they actually said. So verse 24, I said to them, let any who have gold take it off. He did. He said that. So they gave it to me, and I threw it in the fire, and poof, out came this calf. Well, that was a hard left turn from the truth. Like, that is not what happened. He is lying through his teeth. They pitched this gold in just to see what would happen, and magically, you've got this golden calf. Now, it stops right there. His defense stops right there. Aaron lies about his guilt. He's trying to say, it's not my fault. It's the people's fault. It's the fire's fault. It's the gold's fault. It's not my fault. We'll come back to that in a second. Verse 25, when Moses saw that the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose. Did Moses buy that for a second? After his excuse, the text says Aaron let them break loose to the derision of their enemies. Then Moses stood at the gate of the camp and said, who is on the Lord's side? Come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered around him. And he said to them, thus says the Lord God of Israel, put your sword on your side. Each of you go to and fro from the gate to gate throughout the camp. Each of you kill his brother and companion and his neighbor. And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses that day. About 3,000 men of the people fell. And Moses said, today you've been ordained for the service of the Lord, each one at the cost of his son and of his brother, so that he might bestow a blessing upon you this day. Levi, the sons of Levi go through and they cleanse the camp. Basically, anybody who's still being immoral and hasn't stopped this crazy party, dead. No more warnings, no more second chances. They're just dead. Now, you're Moses. What are you going to do? You've just spent close to a month and a half on a mountain with the Lord. You're on the cusp of becoming a nation that pops out of nowhere to go into a land that they don't deserve, but by God's grace you get to inherit. Verse 30. The next day Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin. Let's just stop there for a second. I understand that sin is sin is sin is sin is sin. I get that. But there are some sins that have bigger consequences than others, both here and I think later. There are some sins that are further reaching than others. And I don't think Moses is exaggerating when he says, you've sinned a great sin. Like, this is a big deal. They don't realize that God wanted to wipe them all out. He says, you've sinned a great sin. And now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. Perhaps I can do something to cover over. That's what atonement means. To cover over what you did. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, alas, this people has sinned a great sin. He's confessing to God. They have made for themselves gods of gold. Pay attention to 32. Exodus 32:32. But now, he's talking to God, but now, if you will forgive their sin, and in the ESV there's a dash, because he's leaving it kind of open-ended. He doesn't know how to finish the sentence. Please forgive their sin. Like, what can he say? But if not, if you can't forgive their sin, please blot me out of your book that you have written. Do you realize what he just said? And I think parents and grandparents may relate to this more than younger folks. And if you're young enough that you can appreciate this, I'm really proud of you. He just offered himself in their place. God, I know you wanted to wipe them out. And you have every right to want to wipe them out. This is a really, really big deal. But I'm going to ask you to be merciful toward them. Forgive them. And if you can't, and I'm not saying that you have to, but if you can't then take me and forgive them. He's offering himself in their place. He's offering to sacrifice himself. In his mind, he might not come down from that mountain. He's sacrificing himself. In his mind, he's willing to be that. In verse 33, the Lord said to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book." He doesn't rebuke him, because what Moses has just said is at the heart of the gospel. Moses understands something here that we wrestle with grappling. That someone needs to pay the price. And he's offering to pay it for them. But what he doesn't understand is there are only under certain conditions can someone offer themselves like that. So he doesn't rebuke him. He just says, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book." Like there's individual responsibility here. Paul says something similar over in Romans, where when he's talking about the Israelites, the people of Israel who've rejected Jesus, they're not responding to the gospel, and he says, "Man, I wish that everyone would repent and become a child of God. And I wish I would be accursed and the rest of my people accept it." Same idea. Paul wants other people to be saved so badly that he's willing to be lost if it means they're saved. But he knows he can't do that. And God's trying to teach Moses, you can't do that. And so what he says in verse 33, "Whoever has sinned against me, I'll blot out of my book. But now go, lead the people to the place about which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them." You can go to Numbers 25 where that's fulfilled. "Then the Lord sent a plague on the people because they made the calf, the one that Aaron made." The chapter ends laying blame on where it's due. So you have Moses offer his life for theirs. Now, as we go through these lessons, we're just going to do this really fast. Moses foreshadowed Jesus. Moses foreshadowed Jesus. Every single one of us, according to Paul in Romans chapter 5, where Paul is explaining his understanding of the gospel, explains that every single one of us has been unfaithful. We are all weak. We are all enemies. We're all hostile to God. And it's while we were weak, it was while we were enemies that God sent Jesus. We have all been unfaithful. Every single one of us has fallen short of the glory of God, according to Romans 3. And according to Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and 32, God has every right to be angry with us. We all deserve God's just wrath. What Paul does in that second half of chapter 1 is to establish every single one of us is under the wrath of God. And God is right to be angry with us. But what Romans so powerfully communicates is the intercession of Jesus. Jesus intercedes for us. And if Jesus has interceded for us, over in Romans chapter 6, when it talks about being changed from one master to another, where we were slaves to sin, but now we're slaves to Christ and slaves of righteousness. We no longer present our bodies to immorality. We no longer present our bodies to sin. We present our body as instruments of righteousness. We don't go back to it anymore. And a lot of times we can be like Aaron, where we deceive ourselves about our guilt. I really didn't sin. John talks about that in 1 John chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. Don't let a single one of you say that you don't have sin. You have sin. But it's so easy for us to cushion our sin or sugarcoat our sin. It was just a mistake. Well, it was that. But it's more than just a mistake. I'll tell you, that was one of the most convicting things as I was trying to help Keenan understand the gospel. He had gotten in trouble for something. And I was correcting him. And when we were all done, he apologized to me and he said, "Dad, I'm really sorry." And he meant it. I said, "Hey, I forgive you, man, but I just want to talk for just a second. You realize, like, you and I are good. You and I are fine. But you and God are not. And until you're in Christ, that pile of not good is just going to keep getting bigger. And I don't want you to deceive yourself about that." And within 24 hours, he became a Christian. Right? Don't deceive yourself about your guilt. Just like Levi had to go through the camp and cleanse the camp, what Paul explains over in 1 Corinthians 11 is that we have been washed, we've been sanctified, we've been justified in the Lord Jesus Christ. We have been forgiven, and we have been cleansed. Jesus was able to do what Moses could not. Moses was not in a position, he was not qualified to offer his life for anybody because he had his own guilt he was carrying. But Jesus offers his life for ours. And I just want to hit a handful of verses really quick that emphasize that. When John the Baptist saw Jesus approaching him in John chapter 1, verse 29, he told his disciples, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." That's what Jesus was coming to do. Or in John 15:13, when Jesus actually taught, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends." And that's what Jesus would do. Or in Romans 3:24 through 25, when Paul taught we are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, who God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. We don't use that word propitiation in our regular talk, but it's an important word. Something being a propitiation is a gift that's given to turn away wrath. Jesus was the gift that God gave to turn away his own wrath. Or later in Romans 5:7 through 8, one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And it may sound silly for me to be emphasizing some of these phrases, but it's important. It's crucial to understanding the nature of the gospel. I never thought I'd hear this in my lifetime, but I have heard people sincerely say that Jesus didn't die for anybody. His death was just a death that paid a legal price. I know good-hearted people, and that's what they believe. I love them, but they are wrong. Because if Jesus didn't die for you, you're in trouble. Someone is going to pay that price. And if Jesus didn't, you will. So you need to understand what was done for you. Galatians 3:13 through 14, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. And praise God that he did that. So what are some of the lessons that we can take when we compare that moment where Moses wanted to intervene? He wanted to intercede, but he couldn't. But he foreshadowed the one that would. What can we learn? Just a handful of things. Everyone sins and can't fix it alone. The Israelites sinned a great sin and they couldn't fix it. Not even Moses could fix it. We have sinned great sins and you are not going to fix that. Every single one of us, because of that sin, just like Israel did, and just like everyone else going forward, we all deserve God's just wrath. He is right to be angry with us. And we shouldn't deceive ourselves about our guilt. We stand guilty. There was a guy that was doing a question and answer at some Christian university, and this student stood up, and they were telling this guy who was a Christian apologist, he was a defender of Christian faith. This student stood up and said, "Man, you've said some really hard things about people. Don't you think you're going to hurt people's self-esteem by talking about all this sin stuff?" And the guy didn't miss a beat. He did not miss a beat, and he wasn't cruel. He just said, "Look, if it weren't for the grace of God, you wouldn't be worth a sack of sand." We are animated dirt. Now, granted, I am dirt that is created in the image of God. But God is the one who put that value in me. The only reason I have any value is because of what God has done for me. And the truth is, I mar the image of God with my sin. So I am making myself less and less anything honorable or worthy the longer I live, until I'm back in Jesus and Jesus is fixing my image of God. So much for self-esteem. I mean, the only reason you're worth anything is because of God. So don't get a big head about that. I'm sorry, that sounded really preachy, didn't it? I'm not sorry. We need to celebrate the fact that the life of Jesus was given in our place. And we want to be transformed to become more like Jesus and not go back to what cost him his life in the first place. I think all of those lessons we can see in Exodus 32 and looking at the Gospels and what they have to say about Jesus. So the big question after all of this is, where do you stand? Do you stand trying to carry your guilt under the divine wrath of the Lord? Or have you been baptized into Christ and let his sacrifice and his blood, his atoning blood, be applied to your account so that you stand clean, washed, sanctified, and justified? And if you are in Christ, you're in this process of being remade as an image bearer to be more and more and more like God, shining the glory that he meant for you to shine across his creation. You have to figure out where you are. And if there's anyone that needs to respond to the lesson this evening, come to the front while we stand and